We are back in session, colleagues, and here we are. I welcome everybody to our second work session on the FY 2025 to 2034 Capital Improvement Program. We're going to start with some highlights of the Capital Improvement Program plan, again, I think, Mr. Manager, and then move on to a discussion on transportation and metro. And we're going to have an opportunity between each presentation for some discussion and questions. And just everybody, all the many thousands of people listening at home, today's presentations are available on the county website at arlingtonva.us. And with that, I think we'll get started. Mr. Schwartz.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of things. I wanted to offer a few remarks before we started, and then your point about the presentations we have are fairly lengthy, so both Sarah and Vijaytha are going to try to watch your cues for when you want to pause, because there's no way we're going to make it through all 40 slides and keep everybody's attention without asking questions at appropriate times.
Thank you. This is such a shy group. I'm glad you're encouraging us.
Be sure you speak up. I just did want to take a minute or two. When I've been sitting down and doing the preparation sessions for the CIP and also this presentation, I think it's very important. We're going to spend a lot of time focusing on the plans we have for the next 10 years, but I always want to take a moment and talk a little bit about what we've been doing over the last few years. And I'm especially proud of the work we've done in transportation to enhance our network while at the same time improving our safety and improving access. So, you know, a lot of that work isn't easy, certainly isn't cheap, and we do our best to try to take advantage of grant funds from state and federal government. And one of the real great examples of that was the ribbon cutting we just did for Boundary Channel Drive. And I think that's an example of something where we're able to improve safety, get some assistance from the Commonwealth, and actually partner with them on how we were doing the work. I'm also really impressed, because I get to see it all the time, as do you, with some of our creativity and agility. If you've been on George Mason Drive at Park Drive, right before you want to take that turn into the Lubber Run Community Center, I think that Huey is there. There's 8 examples of Huey standing in the middle of the road telling you, be careful when you take that turn. And then another one, which we've just started, which is this center line hardening, which is to try to give people a sense of where they're going. So these are things that, you know, we hadn't done in the past, but I think are examples of things that are creative. Now, we can always talk a little bit about how we've gotten the gold level bicycle friendly community award, which I think is really cool. And then also, I know one of the topics, we even talked a little bit about it when we were at the school board the other night, is our ART transit service and how it interrelates with schools. So I know we have work we want to do in the future, but I did want to let you know that year over year, our student ridership has increased over 14% through the iRide program, and that on the Metro bus, our student ridership on that program has more than doubled this year alone, from 4,500 trips to a little bit over 11,000. So, you know, we have lots of plans, strategic plans, and lots of things we talk about, but pun intended, the rubber meets the road here in transportation, and we have a lot to go through. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Crawford and Vijaytha Huffman, who are going to walk you through our plans. So over to you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. And as we're pulling up the presentation again, my name is Sarah Crawford, Assistant Director of Transportation. I'm here with Vijaytha Huffman, our Transportation Capital Funds Program Manager. And we'll be giving you a presentation of what is in the CIP over the next 10 years. We're also here with Huey Wang, our Deputy Director for Transportation, and all of us should be able to answer any questions you might have along the way. So moving on to the second slide of the presentation, we just wanted to ground our presentation in our goals and objectives for the transportation program. Everything we do is guided by the policy that is our master transportation plan. It is an element of the comprehensive plan for the county, and it provides policy guidance through 2030. We are in active procurement now to begin an update on the MTP, which will begin later this year. We're all really excited at the opportunity to look comprehensively at our transportation network to establish that guiding policy into the future. We also have other community goals that guide the work that we do within transportation. We try to make our street network more biophilic, more impervious or less impervious, more pervious related to the last topic that you all just had. We are trying to be more sustainable within the transportation network, and that's sort of an arc over the entirety of our program today, how sustainability was a theme over the past several decades and how that continues within this current CIP. We also look towards equity to make sure that our transportation improvements are accessible to those who rely on them most, who don't have other choices in the way that they get around. And then finally, safety. Safety underpins every single thing that we do within transportation and all of the programs that you'll hear about today. All of this also supports economic development and continuing to position Arlington County as competitive and as an attractive place to live, work, visit, and recreate. On the next slide, we talk about some of the highlights from our program. The presentation today is split loosely into our Complete Streets portfolio, so we'll talk a lot more about the programs that you see on the screen, as well as some major transit investments that we're making throughout the county. As I just mentioned, Vision Zero is embedded throughout the entirety of our program, but we do have a specific street safety improvement program that will highlight some of the work that Mr. Schwartz just mentioned earlier. We do have assumptions within the CIP. All future bus purchases are assumed to be battery electric buses. We do anticipate full implementation of the adopted transit strategic plan starting in FY26 and with completion by the end of the CIP period. We do have funding for a number of different multimodal studies within the CIP. I do note that because of funding constraints, we do not have funding for construction of the outcome of those studies. Local funds, we just don't have that capacity in the CIP. And then finally, as per guidance over the last several of CIP cycles, all of our PAYGO and bond requests are limited to state of good repair projects and bridges. Next slide.
You're supposed to ask your chair, but yeah,
Yes, I asked my chair first.
sure.
Okay.
But make it quick.
So on the studies that we can, so like, for example, George Mason, et cetera, can you elaborate a little bit which studies are?
So we have funded studies in the CIP, and those are,
Implementation.
excuse me?
It was about the implementation.
It's about implementation, that's correct. In the previous CIP, as we'll hear about in a couple minutes, we had programmed local dollars in the mid to out years for implementation of something that might come out of the MTP or from studies that were yet to be conducted. We don't have capacity in the CIP to do so. We do have external funds plugged into the CIP, but because of the eligibilities related to the various different funding programs and the fact that we don't know yet what is coming out of these studies, we don't know if that's a good fit or not. We just hope to be able to tap into external resources for implementation.
So how will the MTP inform us about, aligning funding?
Well, I will also discuss this on a subsequent slide.
Would you
but
prefer to just keep going?
I can answer this last point, though. I think it is useful
Yeah.
that by the time we get to the fiscal 29 CIP, we'll have a fully adopted master transportation plan or whatever it may be called. And at that point, we'll have an additional 4 years at the end of the CIP.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide here, this shows our 10-year proposed CIP, and the submitted CIP is 1.85 billion, and understandably, it is a bit front-end loaded because we have several large projects, in particular large transit projects that are moving forward over the next few years. Now, below the submitted CIP line, you will notice that we have an implementation adjustment, and this is consistent with what we've had in the prior CIPs, where because we have unexpected delays and issues that can impact our projects, and it can be anything that ranges from securing easements from our projects to waiting on private developers to do something or other third parties that may be involved. We don't specifically know which projects are going to be impacted. We just know that there will be unexpected delays. And for that reason, we recommend putting an implementation adjustment. Over 10 years, it works out to roughly 20% of the CIP. So net of the implementation adjustment, what we have then is a CIP of 1.5 billion over 10 years. Then on this next slide, I'm just going to highlight some key changes relative to the fiscal 2023 adopted CIP. So one of the big changes is that we have included the entire cost of transitioning the ART fleet to zero emission buses, and specifically to battery electric buses, to BEBs. That's been consolidated under a new program that we have titled the ART Fleet Transition to ZEB. And this is not to say that we had none of this in the adopted CIP. We had select elements of it, just not the full cost. And those elements were scattered across a few different programs. For the sake of transparency, we determined it was best to consolidate all of these costs in one program. And in this program, we have about $134 million across 10 years. Little more than half of that relates to vehicles. And actually, Ms. Crawford will be going through a slide specifically on that. But just to give you a sense, a little more than 50% of the $134 million relates to vehicles, and the balance of it relates to land acquisition, construction, charging equipment, some things as small as pavement reinforcements, but we tried to pick up all of these costs. The next point I wanted to highlight is several of our transit projects that are moving forward. We've had some significant cost escalations on them. That has been picked up in the CIP. And then, as Ms. Crawford mentioned, on the Complete Streets portfolio, we have had to remove a lot of the local funding in the later years. And I want to just sort of clarify this point just to make sure there's no confusion, because I want to clarify that we have had to make trade-offs in the CIP. But the trade-off is not between battery electric buses and the TSP. Both of those are fully reflected and funded in the CIP. The trade-off specifically is between those programs and Complete Streets programs, which by necessity we did have to remove the funding because we simply do not have adequate resources to have included the funding for those programs. So I just wanted to clarify that. One exception is a street safety improvement program, which is part of our Complete Streets portfolio. So where it relates specifically to improvements relating to safety, maybe not walkability or multimodal improvements, but specifically relating to safety, that we have actually increased the funding by 50%. And that's in anticipation of the fact that we have been moving much more quickly on these projects. We have a variety of quick build projects and actions that we're taking, and this is to be responsive to board and community expectations. And finally, we have been able to reduce the funding for both our paving and our bridge maintenance programs because the condition of those assets has improved, so we were able to reduce the funding. So then moving on to the next slide, this just shows you the distribution of the funds across programs and by funding source. And again, I'm just going to point out, using this pointer, to the operating cost line, little chart piece of the pie here, and that is where the TSP is, along with the several other elements of operating costs. So that is fully funded here. And then, of course, we've got transit, Complete Streets, program administration, maintenance, CapEx. Largely, this is consistent with the adopted CIP. There has been a little bit of shift in funding away from Complete Streets towards transit and operating costs. And then by funding source, you can see we've got our existing funds, which is actually a much smaller share of the CIP this time around at 21%, compared to close to 30% in the last CIP. And this is simply a reflection of the fact that we have actually been implementing a lot, for example, Columbia Pike Streets projects and all of that, and we have run down balances. And then you can see all of our other funding sources, including federal and state grants. Those are new grants, and then our funding from our regional partners. But when you think about the overall CIP, the $1.5 billion, about 40% of it is from external sources, including state and federal grants, and also funding from our regional partners. The balance 60% are local funds. Then moving to the next slide, this is just really a detailed view of the 10-year CIP. I think we can get to the next slide. And this shows our proposed bond referendum for this November. It is $29.8 million. It is a little lower than what we had in the adopted CIP for November of 2024. Paving, of course, remains our biggest program for bond funding, although it is lower than what we had requested or what we were anticipating requesting in the last CIP. And then the other, I think, big difference compared to the last CIP is bridge maintenance, where we would have anticipated requesting close to 1.5 million, and we're actually requesting only $500,000. And this is really a great example of a program in which 5 years ago, the county made a decision to invest in our bridges and to really improve the condition of our bridges, and it's really paid off. And we'll have more on this coming up.
Okay, so now we're going to shift to talk a little bit about our program. We're going to start with an overview of the CIP interactive map. This on the screen right now shows all of the transportation projects. And now it's become interactive. And so Ms. Talley is going to guide us through the use of this map. You see you can filter by program, and she's going to go down and select transportation so you can see the screen capture that we had on our slide in the interactive map. You can also filter by category, and I think she's going to select complete streets for us, and that further narrows down the projects on the screen. And depending on what your interest is, if you want to see the funded projects, you could select funded, like Ms. Talley just did, and that further narrows down the projects that you can see in your interactive map. And let's say you're interested about what's going on Longbridge Drive. It's something that you go to the aquatic center, you hear that there might be a rail project coming, you want to see what the county's doing. And you can look up Longbridge Drive and see that we have a project that is funded in the CIP since it's within the funding filter. And when you click on the name, you can get a little bit more information about the Longbridge Drive project. It's a project on Longbridge Drive to improve bicycle connectivity in anticipation of the bike ped bridge across the Potomac that the Virginia VPRA, Virginia Public Rail Authority, I didn't quite get that right, VPRA is building so that we can provide the connecting infrastructure down to our trail network and the Crystal City Bike Network. But what's even better is there's a link on this box that you can click, and it will take you to the project website, where if you scroll down, you can see all sorts of details about the status of the project, a sort of overview. Sometimes we have a map depending on where the project is in development, and you can learn a little bit more about the background of the project. So that's just a little bit of an overview of the interactive CIP map related to our transportation program. And so back to the presentation. We wanted to highlight Capital Bike Share again. We discussed Capital Bike Share at the budget work session, but because I love CABI so much and because it is doing so well, I had to highlight it again for the CIP presentation to talk about our 10-year investments in Capital Bike Share. The region, the system, just hit an overall record. In May, we had 510,000 rides system-wide. That's record-breaking. We've never been above 500,000 before. 38,000 of those rides were in Arlington, also a record, up 5% from our previous highest month. And these are only rides from members. It doesn't account the rides that a person might purchase like a one-off on their own. So there's even more rides happening, but we can track the membership rides. And speaking of membership, one of the things that we wanted to highlight are equity memberships. We have
So before you go, I think you have a question.
Sure. Okay.
CABI question. So does that include, because you can also ride CABI through Lyft, does it track people who are using the Lyft app and not the CABI app?
That's a really in-depth question that I don't know the answer to, but we can
Okay.
get you the answer.
Yeah,
on
I'm just
that.
curious if, if that is included, great, and if not, I'm wondering how
Is
much
it even
more-
bigger?
Yeah.
Exactly.
No,
We
excellent
can revert with that.
It would lift the numbers up.
I-
Yeah, we should have some kind of a jar and every time, anyway, Takis, Mr. Karen, Takis, this is a work session. Takis, go
Yeah,
ahead.
it's a further uplifting part of the conversation. The e-bikes
Yes.
that we introduced just 2 years ago now,
Yes.
the new ones. I have heard from competent sources that almost half of the increase in the use is e-bikes.
I don't have the figure on that right now, but your
That's the order
sources
of
are pretty
magnitude.
good, yes.
Okay.
It's been a huge uptick, mainly because of the e-bikes. We understand that DDOT is purchasing more e-bikes. We are also in queue to purchase more e-bikes. We all invest in our own infrastructure that's shared across the system. So we're at a moment with CABI, and it's getting bigger. But one of the things related to equity that I did want to focus on are CABI for All memberships. It's a program that allows people to purchase an annual membership for just $5, and most of the rides under a certain amount of time are for free. You do have to meet certain federal requirements, and a lot of our community partners listed on the screen help us to reach those riders and make that registration seamless and instantaneous for them. We saw an uptick in equity members within Arlington surge in April. These are the April numbers, so we added even more in May, and equity rides across the system have increased as well. Over 4,000 trips were taken by members in April. And so we look at this not only as a system to support a sustainable multimodal network, but it's also a system that can provide opportunities for all people, no matter of your ability to pay, to get around in a sustainable manner. So our CIP does invest in this infrastructure and operations and maintenance over the 10-year period to the tune of about $40 million.
So I'd just like to add there are different kinds of equity. And what we were just discussing with the e-bikes, that's equity in people who maybe aren't so physically fit.
Right.
And it's really, you're really expanding it. There's all different kinds of equity, and then we're really reaching a lot of people. This is great.
Can I add? I just saw on social media today, the Red Line has shut down for the summer, and a lot of people are really struggling with their commute because they rely on public transportation, and the bus option has not been ideal. And someone posted that they tried an e-bike for their commute this week. It is faster than their metro ride used to be, and so now they're like, I'm just gonna do this permanently. But I think in terms of, so many dimensions of equity, the e-bikes really close down places that can feel really far. If you're commuting from Rockville or Bethesda, a normal bike ride, that is going to be overwhelming and probably not possible for most people. But an e-bike, it's 40 minutes, and it's a pretty casual 40 minutes too. So I think that's just really important. And I think the more people try it, to Takis's point, the more that they really like it, and demand is going to keep being there. So I'm glad to hear we're also in queue to purchase more e-bikes.
This is great. Metro transformed the region, and now we're going to maybe do it with bikes. It's cool. Go ahead. All right, one more, yeah.
So
Sorry, how are we
it
doing
is-
down here?
it is really
The lights are on
important.
down here. I'll have to try to keep this moving. Go ahead. Yes, I'll get you
It's
guys.
about the equity memberships.
Right.
We found out through the pandemic how many people actually need the system and use the system. It is a good thing to advertise it more. Just that. A sticker on the bikes. Here is, read about that. They're in equity membership. We can find a way to convey that more.
Spread
Because
the
a lot of people, there's still a persistent idea that a red bike will cost something per minute or so. It's 45 minutes free.
It's 60 minutes free for equity members. Yeah, no, it's an even better benefit.
We clearly need better information out there. Thank you, Matt.
Just so I understand, you said $5, so those 512 people are paying $5. Is that it? Did I hear right?
So for the annual membership, it's $5, and assuming that ride can stay under 60 minutes, that's free.
Okay, got it. And then there might be extra individual rides. Okay. And this is tied to various, you mentioned obliquely, but am I thinking right that SNAP benefits,
Yes.
Medicaid eligibility, those sorts of things?
It's 6 federal programs, and those are included.
Thanks.
Excellent. Susan?
I had a question back a few pages. On page 5, it said 2 questions. One is the escalation on transit projects. Is that just running with rather regular construction escalation, or is it higher? What's that estimate?
So,
Sorry.
So I should mention that one of the big projects on which we've had some significant cost escalation is the Crystal City East Entrance project. And that is something that we had discussed with the board about a year ago, before we sort of went ahead and entered into the PPEA arrangement with JBG Smith and Clark Construction. The cost of that project went up by $51 million. We anticipated it actually in the last CIP, in the adopted CIP, but we didn't, in the absence of new information, we felt it was best to just keep it at the lower number. But now that we have that information on Crystal City East Entrance, we have also been somewhat conservative on our estimate for Ballston West Entrance in anticipation of some additional costs, including costs relating to WMATA's oversight, for example, that we have included for Ballston West. So there's been some cost escalation there. So it's, I think, primarily those 2 projects. And then we also have a new estimate for the courthouse second elevator project. It's 2 new elevators that we anticipate adding. So it's a few of those transit projects.
Okay, Great. And a similar, same page, you mentioned that the 23 adopted CIP had the bus transition costs in a lot of different buckets. Like, what's the rough total of what it was in 23?
The rough total of all of those costs in 23, I believe, might have been like, it was about 60 or 70 million dollars across different CIPs, because we had a second phase to AOMF, the operations and maintenance facility. We had about $20 million in that. And we also had some added costs in our art fleet replacement and expansion CIP workbooks for the incremental costs for some buses. But we had assumed that the ratio, because of range limitations, would only impact the purchase of the 15 buses. And actually now the 15 buses, it's the last set of buses for which we placed an order for CNG, RNG. But for those buses, we had anticipated a ratio of 2 to 1. And therefore, for an additional 15 buses that would have to be procured at a little over $1 million. But for the rest of the purchases in the art fleet replacement CIP workbook and expansion, we had assumed a 1-to-1 ratio. We had just put in a little bit more because battery electric buses are a little bit more expensive. So in total, when you just add up the 20 million, 35, 40, it's about 50 million, but I can get back to you with the exact numbers.
Okay, yeah, and then what I'm trying to map to is the 134 that's projected for the next 10 years. Are we
Yes.
roughly on track? I know it's a little bit tricky to tie back, but just to be able to compare those. So it's like the 8 years that
It
were
is,
remaining.
but the one thing to keep in mind also is that when you compare CIP over CIP, it's a different set of years.
Yeah.
So for example, the last 2 years that have been added on to this CIP period, there's 20 buses being purchased in the very last year of the CIP that were not there in the last CIP,
Right.
simply because the last CIP ended in fiscal 32. So it's a little bit not exactly apples to apples.
Yeah.
This CIP is also where we have included the cost of the land purchase in fiscal 2027. We did not put that in the last CIP. So I think that's a fairly significant departure.
Okay, great. And one last question, same page. I love this page. The street safety improvements. You said the complete streets and the quick builds and all of that, is kind of constrained by the transit and the bus purchases. How big a breadbasket is it? Like, if we just wrote a check for all that we feel like we wanted to do, are we 1% of the way or 99% of the way, or just, is it infinite? Is there any way to size that? Does the question make sense?
I would leave street safety improvements out of that because
Okay.
I feel like at this point with the staffing levels and the capacity we have, it is maxed out.
Got it. For the emergency quick build.
Quick builds or the proactive quick builds, not even emergency. For our Complete Streets program, we did have to cancel and defer some projects, so that could be quantified. We can't yet quantify the outcomes of the studies because we just don't know what those might be to be able to develop a cost estimate.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I think we're ready to go on to recent achievements.
Okay. All right, well, I will go through these slides fairly quickly. I don't want to minimize what our teams have been able to do, but we have a lot of active transportation across the county. We'll talk more about Columbia Pike in just a moment. We do have a prefabricated bridge that will be placed at Shirlington Road alongside the existing road bridge. Army Navy Drive is under construction, and it's challenging right now to get around. That's unfortunately the nature of progress is construction can be messy, and we do our best to mitigate that. The next project on the slide is a small project, the Roslyn-Ballston Corridor accessibility improvements. There's spot improvements throughout the Roslyn-Ballston Corridor to improve accessibility for the street network or the sidewalk network. We have a number of signal projects active throughout the county. We also have several projects that are in procurement. A partnership with Parks has been awarded on South Eads and moving forward. And we have a project that will improve intersection safety on North Ohio Street. And very soon we have the East Falls Church Bus Bay expansion project going out to bid. On the next slide, we have some projects that have recently been opened, from street and intersection projects in Crystal City, the bridge rebuild at West Glebe, smaller intersection improvements throughout our neighborhoods, and then the Boundary Channel Drive interchange that we talked about at the beginning of the session. On to the next slide. I alluded to this earlier in my remarks, but we wanted to focus on how transportation and sustainability are so interrelated in this presentation. If you recall, during our last CIP cycle, we reviewed the connection between economic development and land use and our transportation network and the associated improvements. We'd like to take a couple of slides to talk about how decades of investments in the past in transit, bike infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, and intersection improvements have led to more people choosing sustainable travel modes over time, creating a better outcome for greenhouse gas emissions in Arlington, and what we have in this CIP to continue moving that forward into the future. So on the next slide, we have a couple slides that we're going to dive a little bit into some data. This data is from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Transportation Planning Board. It's the Regional Household Travel Survey, and it's conducted every 10 years. The two time periods we have on the slide are from 2007, 2008, and then 2017, 2018. This slide focuses on the share of daily trips by mode, and each bar along the graphs represents 100% of trips in Arlington broken down by color by the mode. And I'd like to draw your attention to the blue and teal bars on the screen. Those are auto trips. Those are people either driving alone in blue or driving with someone else in teal. And you can see that there's been a fairly significant downward trend in people driving in Arlington, most notably in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. Those trips are down 18%. That mode shifted to 18% to other modes within that 10-year period. There's a change on the other corridors and elsewhere in Arlington. It's not as significant, but definitely worth noting. I'd also like to focus on the orange bars. Those are walk trips, and those increased significantly throughout Arlington, and again, notably in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. Transit ridership has been uneven, as you can see, between this 10-year period. And if you'll recall, prior to the pandemic, there were concerns about safety on Metro, and I think that was a bit uneven. We had been experiencing increased bus ridership over the years, so this is one category, it's a catch-all. And then finally, the magenta bars are, you can see the increase, and I wish I could say that was all bike trips. A lot of that's TNC. So the TNC impact has been fairly substantial over this time period, but it did also include a slight uptick in bike trips as well. I'm sorry, transportation network companies, that's Uber, Lyft, and the like. Yes, thank you.
These are all the scooters and the other bikes, the Lime bikes, etc.
Yeah, and that would be in the magenta too. So on the slide that we just pulled up now, we have a different set of trends, vehicles per household. And we wanted to highlight this because ownership of a vehicle is a commitment. It is a big investment for many households. And the trends between 2007 to 2017 show a fairly notable shift in reduction of vehicle ownership per driver per household, again, particularly in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. So this does track with the mode shift that we saw on the previous screen. But it is notable in other areas of the county. The other Arlington category also had a fairly significant shift in reduced car ownership per driver per household. This is a choice for many households, but it is a reality for other households who may not have that choice, where private vehicle ownership is simply unattainable. And so we look at these trends, both related to mode shift and car ownership. And as a public agency, we have this responsibility to ensure that we continue to provide and build upon the decades of investments that kind of led, we hope, we're inferring, to this shift. And we continue those investments through this CIP.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Can we look at breakout families that have one car and families that have more than one car? Because I would think that might be, sometimes you just like need a car, but we used to like to need multiples. I'm just curious if that's broken out.
So I didn't do a great job in explaining the breakouts on this particular slide. The blue are 0 vehicles per driver per household. This gets a little bit wonky in the designation of this. The teal is 0 to 1 vehicles per driver per household. So I think that's representing that,
Got it.
that
No, got it.
family
The
unit
colors
you're
are just
talking
dark.
about.
Yep, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask you just one thing? There's one thing, there's one blue that kind of impresses me. Under other Arlington, it jumps up, it almost doubles
Yes.
the single car ownership.
Yes.
I mean, the one corridor that performs almost very well is Rosslyn Ballston, obviously. Route 1, yes, or even Columbia Pike, but that increases. Any insights of why?
I don't have any insights.
Okay.
I
fine.
also found that notable, though.
Just anecdotal.
Something to think about. Yep. Thank you.
All right, so we wanted to look at the annual VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled, and the annual greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, for on-road transportation. And there is a clear association here, a correlation between these trends. The dark lines on the graph, so dark blue, dark green, those are just the raw data, the annual numbers. But the lighter lines, I guess, the light blue and the light green, show the data per capita. And so as our population has increased over this time period, we have still seen a reduction in VMT and in greenhouse gas emissions over this time period. I think it is very fascinating to see the pandemic dip. We all would have expected to see something on this type of a graph. But what is telling is where we are, or were, I guess I should say, in 2022, when things were normalizing a bit. We still don't have a handle on travel trends, and hopefully we will by the next time the household travel survey is conducted, so we can get a really good data point. But we have a moment right now to see where the next dot on these line graphs go and where our investments are placed to ensure that we continue to see a reduction in VMT and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And there are a number of different strategies through our Transportation Capital Program and other programs that we can take to get there. Moving to the next slide, we talk a little bit more granularity about this. This is from the Community Energy Plan, and the blue half pie pieces on the chart represent the on-road transportation emissions, and that's a significant portion of emissions within Arlington. That's where we have opportunities through mode shift and car ownership, which we saw we're tracking together, to provide opportunities through our CIP to fund projects that allow for people to continue to make those choices, to continue to incentivize mode shift, to ensure that that line graph for greenhouse gas emissions and VMT doesn't continue to shoot up. It continues that trend down. And so we hope through the CIP that we are presenting today that we move that bar farther over the next 10 years. Okay. So moving into discussion on the CIP, we simply want to note on this slide that our CIP, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is grounded in our master transportation plan and a whole host of other sector plans, other elements of the comprehensive plan, and other studies that have been conducted. Next slide, please. We're going to walk through the entirety of the transportation program, focusing on the transit capital program first, then complete streets, and then capital maintenance, and perhaps we can break after each one to take discussion. I did want to.
I think we have a question.
We're breaking down.
I was just going to ask a quick question on the transportation trends before we get deep into the numbers.
Sure.
Because I'll never be able to get back. So I know, it's a 10-year interval for the survey, which is kind of crazy long. So do we have any dipstick kind of tests to try to calibrate in between? Do we have any? And particularly with the COVID changes, I'm guessing that is pretty relevant. So how do you deal with that uncertainty of the perfect survey instrument here in between the 10?
So we don't have something that replicates this level of travel data, but we do have the Arlington County Resident Survey. We have a State of the Commute Survey that is conducted every 3 years on commute trips. So we have things that we can it's almost like if you look at, well, that's not a good example, but.
Talk about an elephant. You don't know it's an elephant.
Oh, I like that. That was better than what I was coming up.
Is that a new
They do still do that in Delhi, but maybe not here.
high greenhouse gas emissions? We can't do that.
We don't have as comprehensive, but we do have various points that we can check into. We have our traffic counts, we have the annual VMT, but we don't have anything as granular.
And I guess anecdotally, people are say that it's so much easier to drive right now, that they're driving more? Like, are you seeing that in the data? And is this giving us a little bit of better story than we're likely to see when we?
I am worried. That's why I mentioned, like, we're at that pivotal point right now where we don't have the 23 data yet, but I'm nervous it's going to continue going up. And so the decisions that we make and how we can guide people to transportation through transportation demand management, through services provided by our Arlington County Commuter Services, that layered on the infrastructure we provide will hopefully move us in a good direction.
Just maybe,
Wait, let me just make sure she,
I have a separate question, so go ahead.
okay, separate question. Takis?
maybe as an addition, through the COG process, the 2050 and 2045 visualized, there is also now an ability, we'll see if it's converting into a real input of data from those who are producing data all the time, like Google, et cetera. We get to understand better how people move in the region from other sources right now. This begins to be available, and that's begins to be available on the regional level, and so we will be benefiting from that as well.
Yes.
But yesterday and today, for example, the congestion numbers here in the Washington, D.C. area were staggering, absolutely impressive.
All right. Susan?
Likewise, is there any understanding of whether, like the increase in bike trips, for instance, is it coming from buses? Is it coming from cars? Is it just new trips because it's more convenient? Do we have any sense of that?
The way that the data is compiled, it's not new trips because it's just it's a percentage of all trips. I think the assumption is made because of the modes that have gone down significantly, it would be from car trips. However, you did notice on the graph for mode split, transit did go down slightly in some locations. And so where did those trips go? Was it to TNC? Was it walking? Or was it to Capital Bike Share? We don't know.
Okay, great. And then just one little bit on the greenhouse gas. I know in the community energy plan, we kind of look at it two ways. One is the point emissions, which I think is this one, and the other is the overall emissions, where at least in our solid waste plan discussion, like solid waste pops up as much more crucial. So just to highlight that for the community, because sometimes looking at it different ways.
Thank you. And I had a question on the greenhouse gas input on that the graph. What proportion of the transportation emissions comes from the ART system, or ART buses?
It would be within the 4% of county government, including APS.
And do you know, I think we do know from another slide what it is. I think it's really tiny.
Someone knows.
Yeah, it's like
I know.
0.06 or something, as I recollect.
It's less,
No, there you go.
it's less than
Yeah.
1%. I remember, it's like a very tiny slit.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, we're going to keep going. I know there's a lot of disagreements on this, but I just want to point out, we're pouring millions and millions and millions into electric buses, and we will solve less than 1% possibly. So I'm really worried about the amount of money we're thinking of putting into electric buses in our system that nobody's riding on. Not nobody, that's false, not nobody, no. That not enough people are riding on. We need to get more people on buses, as Maureen keeps, bringing up. What goes it to have electric buses if nobody's on them? We need to be able to get the chance, and maybe this isn't the time to pour all that much money into electric buses. I know I may be in a minority on that one, but I just want to keep bringing that up. We need to keep in mind how small that percentage is, and what else we need to do. Thank you. Next week, I think we can go on now.
Okay, before we get into the program slides, I did want to explain this graphic that you'll see at the top of all of the capital program slides. We're calling it our annual spend intensity. And this graphic gives you a sense of how much spend of both local dollars in teal and grant funding in purple is being expended on each fiscal year. And that will give you a rough sense of the magnitude of that program in any given year. The range of the little sample on the left, at the low end, it's the lowest we have, about $100,000 or even less. It's just whatever is the lowest, not zero. And then the highest spend intensity is $30 million per fiscal year or above. So we'll start looking, it's not a great example to start with, the art operations and maintenance facility, because we will be finished within fiscal '25. That facility will be complete, and we will be able to finally ground the art fleet within Arlington. This is something that's been a long time coming and will really improve our operations and service. This also includes charging for 12 battery electric buses on this site, a fast charger, and then solar panels on the roof of the facility. We also included a description on this slide of the art fleet transition to ZEB, and Ms. Huffman provided an overview of why that's new and how it's a kind of compilation of elements from the past CIP and new elements as well. This is our catch-all program to convey the incremental costs needed to expand the fleet and supporting infrastructure for this conversion to ZEB. In this case, that's battery electric buses, BEBs. We do have our separate programs within transit that fund the replacement of art buses and the expansion of art buses. Those are assumed to be RNG in this case, and then this program would fund the additional increment for BEB. This also includes the land acquisition, as Ms. Huffman mentioned, was necessary. So on the next slide, we can see the funding intensity for the transition to ZEB, and you can see that all of this is anticipated grant funding. We have been fairly ambitious in our assumptions of our return on external grant, our success there. We have a variety of state, federal, and regional grants that we've anticipated that we've tried to strategically place on the different assets that will need to be procured, or land in this case. But still, it's a risk that we can never be sure when we're going to have grant success or not, no matter how hard we try. The intensity in fiscal '27 relates to the land purchase, and then the intensities that you see in the later fiscal years relate to bus purchases and also fitting out the sites that we have for the charging infrastructure. This assumes a cost of the battery electric buses at $1.2 million. We do have a ratio that's slightly lower than the ZEB study at 1.3 to 1.1, and that's due to additional conversations we've had with operators from other jurisdictions, as well as evolution in the technology, because it is evolving quickly. And to that point, I do want to highlight the note at the bottom of the slide. These assumptions will be refined after we run the pilot of the BEBs to truly understand how they perform on our routes. We could have better information in terms of lower cost. It could cost more. We just don't know yet. So we've tried to set our assumptions conservatively, but also not too conservatively. This does include 20 additional buses due to that ratio, and so therefore we will need more land, not only to park the buses, but to house the charging infrastructure necessary to be able to charge the buses, and construction on not only the new land, which has not been identified, this is just an estimate at this point, and then a later time battery replacement. I did want to note, since we've been using RNG in this presentation, that in fiscal '25, we will be able to begin using RNG to service the art fleet.
And by that, you mean renewable natural gas? Is
That's
that what you-
correct.
Which we're going to be producing?
I'm sorry?
Which we're going to be producing, we're getting it somewhere else?
For FY '25, we're starting to purchase that.
Okay.
But our wastewater plant is actually actively pursuing produce our own. So basically, we are going to turn our own waste into germ.
And when are we going to do that? Do we know?
I believe it's 29.
29.
Yeah, okay, good.
But in the meanwhile, we buy credits for RNG.
Correct.
Yeah, yeah, great, which makes a whole lot of sense. Thank you. Susan?
So I know there's been lots of study and lots of conversation about the replacement ratio. I think at one point we had 2 and we got it down to 1.6, and now it's at 1.3. And I think a lot of folks in the community would say that the data is pointing more towards 1-to-1. Could you share a little bit about that, like, recognizing that there's some conservatism probably built in here, but also recognizing for the next 10 years, we still will have quite a number of CNG or RNG buses in the fleet, and we just don't have super long leads or run routes, however you call that.
We certainly hope it goes to 1-to-1. We are working very closely with our basically regional and also nationwide agencies that has adopted BEB or has BEB on their fleet. We're checking with them with their experience as well. So far, we have not seen any place that has reached that golden 1-to-1 ratio. The technology involvement does, make one sort of hopeful that's going to go down. And you can see when we conducted our zero emission study, the consultant study recommended ratio was 1 to 2 and then 1 to 1.59. So with what we've learned, we are walking that number down, but we're not comfortable at this point to just plan it at 1-to-1, because we want to make sure our program is well-funded when we need the money.
So I guess I would just tag that that's really important to your point, Libya, about kind of how costly that transition is. I think it's very important to our community, but that assumption also drives, extra parking area and land area and charging. And so I assume we'll have checkpoints along the way to make sure that we're getting close to that 1-to-1. And again, with the rounding of the still years of natural gas buses to back us up if we misjudge.
We have 4 pilot BEBs that are already ordered and arriving next year. So we're hoping that we can use that pilot bus to run all of our routes to get the actual ratio in Arlington, in our climate, on our routes.
If I may, if you notice the funding intensity on the slide, we were intentional about allowing the pilot to happen and allowing us to collect data from the pilot before immediately going to a high cost outlay. So it is tracking such that we'll be able to gather data before we were to have to make a large investment, but we have to program for that so that we're ready for it if we need to make it.
Excellent. Takis?
So I hear you on this. I understand that. In the discussions that we've had on decarbonizing the fleet, we said 2 things. There are 2 dials there. One is the size of the battery, actually. So we decided to, or I believe that this was the final recommendation, to go with a slightly oversized battery so that, we are sure that these buses can actually overcome the problem of range wherever this problem appears. The second thing is, we also know that these buses are, we already know from ongoing implementation of these that they are lower maintenance, so you don't have to have so many spare buses in the system if you run a electric bus system. I don't know. And that actually, I visited the yard with the buses in our sister city in Aachen, and they told me that in the selected routes that they had, they also have 14. Their replacement ratio was a little bit less than 1-to-1, only because of less breakdown. Of course, they are newer, they're better, and they are electric, so their mechanical.
It's simpler.
It's simpler. So, do these things count towards our estimate, or is that something that will be also decided as a result of the pilot with 4 buses?
I will say if that proven to be true with our own experience, then certainly they will count. Right now, we are gathering so much information, so we hear good news. We also hear the challenging parts. So we are trying to make an educated prediction for the program, especially the CIP plan is a 10-year plan. Really, it's a matter of us finding the most reliable information and plan with that.
Okay, thank you.
And if we buy buses, we have to buy American, right? So in Aachen, Germany, they're probably using German or something, but we can't use those. We have to use American buses, is that correct?
I believe so.
I think it is. Yep.
Yeah.
I think
We're subject to the Buy American.
Yeah.
Especially,
which can affect how the buses work. Yes, Maureen.
Great. I think I'm glad to see that we're already bringing the ratio down and seeing positive trends in that direction. And I'm super conscious that Dash, our favorite rival in Alexandria, they've fully electrified. They're also seeing some of the best ridership uptake of any bus system in our region. And I'm wondering kind of what things we've seen driving that, and if we know if we have taken any of what they're doing into account, because I think a lot of it comes from the frequency that they're running their service, if that's.
Yeah, good question, and I think they really analyzed what they were doing to come up with it. I think this is for you, perhaps?
Yeah, I think what I heard basically is the performance and the service level of the transit service is, a big driver of how attractive that service is. Yes, I would say that we have room to improve on our performance. We also are trying to sort of make our system more attractive. The TSP that we adopted does call for increased frequency and extended service, longer service per day, and also weekend service that fit into the new transit user pattern. It used to be a very commuter and peak hour oriented ridership, and we've seen the trends of people actually using that for other than commuter trips, which is great. So we're trying to adjust our service to fit into those needs.
Is there, any plan in terms of expansion of our bus fleet in order to supplement or augment our service? Not just battery electric, but just overall, if we have more buses, we can run more routes and more buses.
So that's our next slide.
Oh,
With that, let's get back to the
I love
slides.
to transition
Thank you,
us.
perfectly
Thank
done,
you.
perfectly
That was
done.
Wonderful. So on our next slide, you can see we have two programs for bus replacement, which replaces all of the buses we have now. We have 78 buses. This funds the replacement on roughly a 12-year schedule because that's determined to be the end of their useful life. We also have the ART Fleet Expansion Program, which buys additional buses to ensure that we can provide the service that's been approved in the adopted transit strategic plan. We do have the 4 BEBs that are coming, and the purchase of additional buses sequences throughout the CIP to ensure that we have the buses as we are adding that service per the CIP, and you can see that reflected in the intensity chart at the top of the slide.
And I should also mention that while it is true that we sequestered all of the costs for ZEB in the other program, the 8 replacement buses that are slated for fiscal 2026, those have been included in the ART Fleet Equipment Replacement CIP program at the BEB cost. I should just mention that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we'll talk about some of the other improvements in our transit portfolio. We have a number of improvements to bus operations, our bus facilities. I mentioned earlier that we will have an open procurement for a bus bay expansion at the East Falls Church Metro Rail Station. This is a fairly significant bus to rail transfer location, and this will add additional capacity for buses to lay by at the East Falls Church Metro Rail Station. We have our transitway extension to Pentagon City, which extends dedicated lanes of the Metroway to Pentagon City from Crystal City. And these are both fully funded with a mix of local and grant funds. You can see the funding intensity on the slide. These will be completed by fiscal 27. We have an open application to the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority for bus expansion, bay expansion at the Shirlington bus facility in Shirlington. That is under consideration, and so you can see the additional line for grant funding that this is anticipated. We don't have this approved, and if this were not to come to pass, we would have to make other choices on this project, whether we look to other funding streams, fund locally, or defer potentially. That's a choice for all of our projects that have grant funding. Moving to the next slide.
Can I just ask?
Sure.
The Shirlington Transit Station, so I'm a very, I'm a frequent flyer there. So I've never seen this station completely use all the bays. It has a lot of bays. I mean, why? Is that because Dash will be coming in, or what?
There's a couple of different reasons. We do have coordination with our partners in Alexandria, the additional Dash service on the West End Transitway. We also have service expansion, I believe, in the Transit Strategic Plan. And so we need to accommodate these transfers in Shirlington.
Okay, I will ask about that offline.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay.
We wanted to focus on the Crystal City Metro Rail Station East Entrance that Ms. Huffman spoke about earlier. And as you can see, we have very intense spend over the next 3 years. It's under contract, it's moving forward in the design build process. And so this is advancing on a rapid pace. It is fully funded in the CIP. And I do want to note that this is the first county project that was awarded using the Virginia Public-Private Education Facilities and Infrastructure Act. It's an interesting way of using this type of procurement for project delivery that allows us to deliver a project through a mechanism that is more efficient on our staff. This will provide safety and accessibility improvements as well as better connectivity to the relocated VRE station in Crystal. We've grouped 3 additional Metro Rail station expansion projects on this slide, and as you can see, we now have a very colorful funding intensity map. We have a pretty big spend in the mid-years of both local funds and approved grant funding. That's for Ballston West Entrance. That is a mix of approved grant funding and local funding. This project, as Ms. Huffman mentioned earlier, was conservatively increased due to our experiences with Crystal City East Entrance. We have a range of estimates, and we want to make sure that we have the funding in place to cover it. We have just issued the request for qualifications. That happened in May, and we anticipate issuing a request for proposals to the qualifying firms later this year. So at this point next year, we should be able to have the bids and understand the true cost of this project, hopefully take it into a design build construction delivery similar to that for Crystal City East Entrance. Courthouse Metro Rail Station, the 2 express elevators just outside of our building. That is a future project, and we anticipate seeking a variety of different external grants to deliver that project. We do have a modest mix of anticipated anticipated grant funding and local funds in the latter years of the CIP to understand feasibility of adding a western entrance to the East Falls Church Station. And I should note that the developer contributions are on both Courthouse and Ballston West Entrance. I wanted to circle back to our bus stop accessibility slide that we discussed at the work session for the budget and give a little bit of an update. At that point, we had just received the results of the inventory, and now we've had a little bit more time to review that information and update the numbers. Roughly the same information stands. We have 990 bus stops, 63% of which are not compliant with current regulations, and it stands that approximately 10% are not accessible. All non-accessible stops are grouped in the level 3 that you see on the slide, and will need easements for every single one of the non-accessible stops, which adds time and challenge. I also want to note before I get to a description of the levels that new federal guidance called PROAG, which is Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, was passed earlier this year and will impact a number of our smaller scale programs, which I'll discuss throughout the course of the presentation. The biggest impact of PROAG will be on project delivery immediately adjacent to intersections. When you touch one corner of an intersection per PROAG, you must upgrade the entirety of the intersection to be compliant. So if a bus stop touches that corner, you're doing the whole thing. Those costs have not been accounted for in the CIP because I mentioned this just came out. Cost estimates were developed at the end of last year. So that's a risk. We acknowledge that.
I just wanted to add on that one. You'll hear this also when we get to the RNAC program, which is the neighborhood program.
Yeah.
That is going to have an impact on the number of projects we're going to be able to do. I mean, I've already been told that what had been a street segment that was affordable, now since it touches the intersection, may no longer be affordable. So we'll have to keep that in mind as we go through our conversations.
Yep.
What's the definition of touching the intersection? Like how mid-block are we talking?
To give you an example, if we are upgrading a pedestrian ramp at one corner, that's you must upgrade all the ramps around the intersection. And another example that is going to have great impact on our project is if you're paving the road. So if you've done something on this side of the road and you ended up paving half of the street, that's considered as you're touching it. So on the other side of the street, there are similar features that need to be upgraded.
Wow. Can I ask something on this?
Yeah, go ahead.
So these are the late consequences of having neglected in the United States infrastructure, especially for pedestrians, right? So the question is,
Is there do we have any way, or does the law provide any way to measure actually if we need the upgrade? So, for example, if the ramp in one is mostly okay, it is, ADA compliant.
Or like get a
for example.
waiver or something.
Do we- No?
No.
So we don't have any way to calibrate. We have to assume full impact.
Well, so I think the PROAG rules just came out about a month ago. So there's going to be
Learning curve.
We are not the only ones.
We're not the only
Yeah.
ones who are stressed by this because it is, I would say, it's not quite an unfunded mandate, but it's a further interpretation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's very important. We don't want to neglect the point that is being pushed by PROAG, which is that when you do work, to the extent that you can, you want to make the surroundings accessible. So I think hopefully there will be some, I'm going to say moderate application of the rules, so we'll go through it. But right now, we have not made those assumptions in our CIP because the rule just broke. So what the numbers you're seeing here, I think, are low. And the question is, how high will they go? We don't know.
Yep.
And can I clarify that picture where like the newspaper bins are in the wrong place? If we move them, no. Okay, so the level ones don't trigger this.
And that's part of our strategy, which I can go through on how we're trying to get to compliance under current regulations. Level 1, the newspaper boxes are circled. This is just an example. There's other elements of bus stops that make them non-compliant. It's a quote-unquote simple fix. This can be done fairly quickly. For level 2, this will require a little bit more work. As you can see, we're not at an intersection. This is simply regrading the sidewalk and providing that level access to the bus. Level 3 stops will require significant design and construction elements to the point where they may be folded into complete street rebuilds. And so we haven't gotten to the point yet of parsing out the level 3 stops of what will remain in the bus stop program and be able to be accomplished at sort of a spot level and what will require a larger street rebuild. But we do know that they all require easements. Shifting to the next slide, we can see our goals at this point with the funding levels we have to get towards compliance. And we hope to reach compliance under current regulations by fiscal 2030-ish, and we'll get to close to 70% compliance by the end of the CIP period. And so we feel fairly confident with the blue bars. Those are our level 1 stops. We don't believe that will trigger any PROAG. There may be a handful that it applies to, but we believe we can move through those fairly expeditiously. At the same time, reviewing and advancing design or other necessary elements on the level 2 stops so that we're ready to go and bring those into compliance by the end of the CIP period. We will still have to tease through what's possible with the level 3 stops. That is what we're doing right now, is we're trying to figure that out.
Okay.
That concludes our transit program. So I can shift to our Complete Streets program at this point. Our Complete Streets program is representative of a whole lot of work going on in the right-of-way within Arlington. So how we've grouped it for this presentation is we're highlighting projects within those programs on the slide. This does not represent the entirety of the list of projects within our Complete Streets program. And on this slide alone, we've grouped Bike Arlington, Walk Arlington, and then our Capital Bike Share infrastructure program. So the funding intensity is higher towards the end of the CIP, and that's where we've shifted the Memorial Wall Trail due to funding capacity. We have also tried to anticipate what grant opportunities might be possible and match the available local funds that we have to that. The Arlington Boulevard Trail is moving forward in phases. We do have the Arlington Boulevard Trail South Side moving forward now, and that's in partnership with the National Foreign Affairs Training Center. We did receive an earmark this past session to advance design on that portion of the trail, which is really exciting. And we have an application in for CMAQ funding, so that will be a federalized project. We did have to push the north side project of the Arlington Boulevard Trail to the latter years of the CIP due to funding capacity. There are other segments west of George Mason that are progressing roughly on the schedule that was anticipated in the adopted CIP. We talked already about capital bike share. I'd like to spend a second talking about our countywide pedestrian spot improvements. This is a capital program that advances smaller scale capital improvements, most of which come out of the street safety improvements, the Vision Zero analyses, or other things that bubble up through our C3 program, where we can address pedestrian accessibility through a smaller scale capital project. We also have some projects to improve safety at intersections and along roadways, our Lorcum Lane sidewalk, which builds out a quick build on Lorcum Lane. And then we're signalizing and expanding the curbs at the intersection of North Park and George Mason, which came up earlier. At the bottom of many of the Complete Street slides, we've highlighted the studies that are included within this program. In this case, we will be advancing some of the work the state has funded on Custis Trail to see what's possible regarding renovation and expansion. And then we also have a connection from roughly 4 Mile Run W&OD Trail to Carlin Springs Road that we're anticipating beginning in fiscal '29. I'm very excited to talk about the funding intensity on this slide. It's our Columbia Pike improvement slide, and you can see there is an end. The project will end, and we will be wrapped up on Columbia Pike in fiscal '26. That's when our spending intensity ends. This will conclude all segments of the multimodal project and then allow us to install the transit stations along the entirety of Columbia Pike. This has been a real challenge to the residents and businesses along the Pike, and we acknowledge that, and we are very glad to be towards the end of this project to be able to open up the Pike for full use. What you see in the lighter color in fiscal '27 and '28 is furthering the Bike Boulevards project, as well as the intersection at 9th Street and South Glebe.
Can I ask you something on this?
Sure.
Am I completely wrong? The initial, or about a year ago, I thought it was fiscal year '25 that we would be finishing. right?
Calendar year '25,
Calendar year
which is in
25.
fiscal year '26.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I always assume fiscal years, I never.
And we'll be planting some trees along Columbia Pike.
Yes, we are.
That's part of it.
Yes.
Just checking.
And while we're talking timelines, we skipped over it, but the AOMF is also, it says fiscal year
25.
Correct, fiscal 25.
25. And so that is calendar year 24.
Well, it includes both calendar year '24 and '25.
And for AOMF, maybe Mr. Manager, we still on track?
Yeah, I think we'll get back to you with some more details on that. Our goal has been, I think that by around October, the actual construction will be done, but then there's going to be a few months where we have to do commissioning of the building. So
Okay.
I'm just going to tell you it's going to be in the winter. How's that?
New Year's party.
The climate change winter, or no, just joking. Okay.
And just to clarify for AOMF, it's going to be next for the battery electric components, all the charging components, that will actually be commissioned in a year later.
Correct, right. But the ability to park buses there is,
There won't be any electric buses anywhere
Yes, we
anytime
will.
earlier. So.
Quincy Street, yes.
We have to be out of the Farrington facility.
By end of May or June of next year.
Got a year.
and we have a cushion built in. Okay.
Okay. Keep on.
I'll zip along.
Can I ask one last question on page 29 before we flip? There's been a lot of conversation across many decades about bus stops. And so tell us a little bit about the cost per bus stop here and sort of what the design has landed and how it's standardized. Or do we know yet? Is that still fun to
Oh,
come?
no, we know. This has been decided several years ago, and I'm rusty on my knowledge of the cost. I'm not sure if anyone. Oh,
Okay.
14 divided by 23.
Yeah, 22 stops. Okay. Great. And they're all sort of
I can't do long division.
they're all sort of a standardized design that has weather protection and all
And
that
there
jazz.
was a standardized design from a kit of parts
Yeah.
used for Columbia Pike with the artistic element. So I would call it semi-customized.
Yep. Okay.
And
great.
they are transit stations, which actually serves more
Yes.
people and has more amenities than bus stops.
All right, thank you. We'll move on.
Riders on Columbia Pike are asking when the traffic, the transit information will be on. That's for later.
Yeah, later.
We get those emails.
Yes, maybe on their phones. Okay, go ahead. Yes, we do need to keep moving.
All right.
Thank you.
I will be concise, but
We're not, that's our problem.
too
Keep
concise.
going.
So shifting to our Crystal City, Pentagon City, and Potomac Yard Streets program, we have a number of projects advancing in this program that form the public infrastructure commitment to redevelopment in Crystal City and Pentagon City per the adopted plans in that area of the county. Several projects are under construction right now, as I mentioned before, Army Navy Drive and South East Street, so I won't go into detail on those. We do have several projects that are about to head into procurement, which is really exciting. The complete street on 16th Street, and then the trail that connects from 15th Street to 12th Street, which will then eventually connect to the Long Bridge Drive connection, which you see a little bit later down on the screen. We do have our CC to DCA multimodal connection, which will be a really showcase project that will connect Crystal City to DCA over the span of roughly 1,800 feet, a short walk to get you to the terminal of DCA. That is much of the spending intensity on the top of the screen. You'll see that we do have anticipated grant funding. That's an active application that is into MVTA right now for their consideration. We'll find out later this month if that application is successful or not. But there's risk, right? Again, it's the risk associated with anticipated grant funding. And we do have funds later in the CIP with an anticipated grant to further the construction of the South East Street complete street down to 23rd Street. Okay. Now we're going to embark on one of our largest programs. It's called Improvements Outside Major Corridors. So these are generally improvements along arterials that are not on our major corridors. Not in Roslyn Ballston, not on Route 1, Columbia Pike, or Langston Boulevard. We have a lot of spend at the beginning of the CIP, which is due to projects that have been in design for some years that will be moving towards construction. We do have grant funding lined up for a number of these projects, and then you'll see that the program kind of hums along for a while. There is a larger anticipated grant intensity at the end of the CIP, which was some of that placeholder funding that we spoke about earlier, just to advance what we hope to be some of the studies that come out of our projects. Let's see if I don't need to highlight all of these projects, but I think I'll mention the Arlington View Connector Trail because that's not actually within this program, but we wanted to make sure we incorporated it into the presentation. It is a project that will connect Arlington View down to Army Navy Drive, and we anticipate finalizing design and beginning construction so that the project will be complete in fiscal '28. This was previously called the Army Navy Country Club Trail, so we changed the name to reflect the neighborhood connection that it will make. We also have, whoops, nope, that's okay. We can keep going. I don't want to, you sure? Okay. And so we did highlight some new projects on the next slide. This is a continuation of our improvements outside major corridors. We have $2 million in the CIP for South Carlin Springs Road. This will enable us to immediately expand the sidewalk adjacent to the signal project at 5th Street and provide for unobstructed sidewalks that are delineated from the roadway, providing a wider space for people to walk at this intersection. This will also allow us to advance design and potentially easement acquisition on a larger span of South Carlin Springs Road and to determine what cost that project will be, which could then be worked into the subsequent CIP. We don't have an estimate for that at this moment in time. We are advancing improvements on South George Mason Drive. We recently completed the study, and it's advancing in 3 segments. Along with our coordination with the National Foreign Affairs Training Center, we are working with them on South George Mason Drive as well to realize the trail alongside South George Mason Drive between Arlington Boulevard and Columbia Pike. That is something that's fully funded in the CIP and moving forward. We do have the South George Mason Drive intersection at 4 Mile Run, which is one of our highest crash intersections within the county. We did receive a regional roadway safety program award to look at feasibility for what's possible and to allow us to better get a sense of the cost estimate. That's roughly within the mid-years of the CIP. Segments 2 and 3 of George Mason Drive were moved toward the later years of the CIP with design only for segment segment 3 due to funding capacity. We do hope to attain a $2 million ATIP, which is the latest round of IIJA, more acronyms, Active Transportation Infrastructure Improvement Program, if I can do it off the top of my head, to try to plan and get a design for those 2 segments of South George Mason Drive. And then finally, we anticipate advancing the improvements on Walter Reed Drive after the completion of the Career Center, potentially with some elements being done in conjunction so that they're open when that facility opens. And then, as I mentioned before, a number of different studies that we have in the pipeline on our arterials throughout the county that would follow the MTP update.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Marcus.
So aside from the fact that I think that the 2 million for the South Carolina Spring Roads improvement that goes together with the Fifth Street, et cetera, that I believe that this is a very low number. You said that you're already working on this. Why is the Carolina Springs Road Corridor Study now moved to fiscal year 27?
It's to time with the update of the MTP. The MTP will allow us to have a transportation network analysis that will show us what's possible on South Carolina Springs Road.
But the MTP, we will complete the MTP basically next year, right? We will start now.
I'm thinking
update.
fiscal years or calendar years. Next fiscal year.
Next fiscal year.
25, 26.
I really believe that this is a very high priority project. Not only we hear a lot about that, it's really, I mean, we found out that just in half a mile of that, we have 33,000 vehicles a day. So that's basically a lot of, to me, this is a high risk and high priority project. Anyway, we can discuss that offline.
Okay.
But I wanted to know what drives the, because this seems like moving further out. Every time we discuss that, it was at 26, now it's at 27.
Hui?
I will say, although the entire corridor study is, we are aligning that timeline with the MTP, we did add the project, which is what's, marked as new here, to address some of the immediate needs. So I will say think of that as a two-pronged approach. And the $2 million, yes, it's not significant because the $2 million is just for the immediate signal area plus the design for potentially a longer project.
Thank you. I think we need to discuss that further.
All right, we can discuss it. We'll go, I want to remind everybody, I think we're at 4:15. I think we're hoping to stop maybe at 5, and we still have Metro to go and debt service. Is that right? And more transportation slides. So with that warning,
Madam Chair, I think
Maureen?
this is, oh,
I'll go ahead and hold for an additional Carlin Springs specific conversation.
okay, yeah, let's do that. Thank you, Matt.
and I only had 3 questions for the whole time, because I was a bit tardy coming back, so understanding a little bit the scope of the study that you just mentioned, Wei, will be super important for later, and that's a briefing. And then in this slide, on slide 32, I think 26 is the completion, but if 25 is when we're starting, that's what I'm trying to understand. And so, and then beyond that, I think, I understand the MTP needing to finish. I'd love a briefing, and I want to, you guys have provided, there's a staff capacity question, and then there's a funding question. And so I'm just eager, and I'll yield on that, but I just wanted to outline a little bit that give us options would be helpful.
Thank you. No, and I think it's great. We can surface some things and really get in depth in some briefings, but right now I think we need to keep moving.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Langston, I think we are.
So this is a program that had previously been a placeholder within the CIP, and we have now completed Plan Langston Boulevard, and we are advancing 2 studies that were recommendations from Plan Langston Boulevard, the first of which will focus on areas 2 and 3, as described in that study, and then area 5. The remainder of the program and the spend intensity at the top of the screen is placeholder funding to allow us to then implement those 2 improvements. We had that funding in the past CIP and felt it important to carry it forward. The Neighborhood Complete Streets program is overseen by the Neighborhood Complete Streets Commission, and they have 3 projects that were previously approved and previously funded moving forward in fiscal '25. That's the intensity you see at the top of the screen. We're also piloting some shared streets at 3 locations throughout the county, and the commission will take up additional projects for consideration at its funding hearing next week. This will also be a program impacted by the PROAG guidance. The Roslyn-Ballston Arterial Improvements Project contains a number of corridor and intersection improvements in the corridor. I'll highlight Fairfax Drive at Kirkwood and then our Wilson Boulevard project that will be moving forward to construction soon. But the 3 projects that I wanted to focus on in terms of implementation of Core of Roslyn are the Fort Myer Drive Tunnel, the North Mead Street improvements, and the Roslyn Multimodal Street improvements. These are a suite of 3 discrete projects. Roslyn Street Improvements actually has sub-projects within the project to advance that street transformation in Roslyn to create a safer, more accessible environment. There is risk in this program as well in terms of the developer contributing these elements in the next fiscal year. Street Safety Improvements Program, we've talked a little bit throughout the course of the presentation. We have 3 pots within this program that handles discrete functions, and the funding that you all added as part of the budget will allow those system studies and improvements to move forward to accomplish more of the quick builds, test more temporary treatments. School slow zones are an example of that. And then also, as we shift to the center of the screen, you can see some of the elements that we've added from some of the crash analyses and arterial studies we've done, the hardened center lines at intersections that make it really uncomfortable to turn more quickly than you should and outside of the center line, which improves safety for pedestrians in the crosswalk. And finally, this program has a small amount of capital funds that allow us to advance design and then transfer a project to a different program for implementation. We do have some of our more asset-focused programs in the CIP, traffic signals, intelligent transportation systems, streetlights, parking meters. These are things that we operate and maintain and have to replace, and in some cases expand throughout the county. We did receive some grant funds to do some innovative approaches with parking technology, which we are piloting right now, and then also ITS improvements on some of our major corridors.
Okay, moving into our maintenance capital program. So on bridges, we have bridge maintenance and bridge renovation. Bridge maintenance, I'll just say that with all the intense effort we've had over the last few years, we've done a lot of catch-up maintenance and repair work, and we feel really pretty good about where our bridges are right now. For bridge renovation, that program includes significant improvements, upgrades, and as well as rebuilding of bridges. So the photograph that you see there is actually our new bridge over West Glebe Road that was completed last summer. The 2 active projects in this program currently are the Shirlington Road Bridge project, which has been upgraded with wider sidewalks, and we will be adding a pedestrian bridge to it. The second major project in this program is the reconstruction of the Arlington Ridge Road Bridge project. That is a larger project than the West Glebe Road project. Similar to the West Glebe Road project, the City of Alexandria will be covering 50% of the costs that are not covered by external funding. Then moving to the next slide, the paving program. So here you can see, paving, we do maintain over 1,000 lane miles of streets. And the graph that you see there on the left, the blue lines show you the spending over the years, and the green line shows you the pavement condition index, the PCI, which we measure every year. And you can see that we did hit a low point in the 2014-2015 timeframe. We've been coming out of that. The PCI does lag spending. So, when we had defunded the project many, many years ago, it took a while for us to get our PCI back up again. Our goal is to have a PCI between 75 and 80. So currently, we are handily meeting it since our 2023 PCI was 83. But I should caveat with a couple of factors here. PROAG, of course, which Ms. Crawford has mentioned, is is definitely a headwind for us, which has not been factored into the paving program. The second item I should flag is the markings program. So pavement markings, which have to be restored after the paving program comes through. So a good example is our active project currently on Army-Navy Complete Streets. It's a big project that we have in our Complete Streets portfolio. It's in construction. It's going to have a lot of complex markings on it, lots of lines, lots of different colors. And so in 7 years from now, when the paving program comes through to do the microsurfacing to extend the life of that road, all of those markings have to be restored. And that's a significant cost. The costs are growing because in line with our street safety improvements program, we are making those lines, as I said, they're more complicated, they're more colors, it's just more expensive. I should mention that, again, just in regards to our pavement condition, one thing that we really try to avoid is having the PCI drop below 60. Back in 2014, we had 40% of our streets below 60, and today it's less than 10%. And the reason that's critical is because once your street gets to PCI 55, you can't just come in and take away the 2 inches of asphalt and put two more inches of asphalt back on. You actually have to literally remove all of the underlay, which goes down to like 5 or 6 inches below that street, and do a full street rebuild, and that's very expensive. So it's another reason why we really need to keep this program funded. And finally, I should mention, because this did come up during the budget work session, as to whether we have a similar indicator for our bike lanes. The majority of our bike lanes are in the pavement, and they do get evaluated as part of PCI. And that's another criteria I should just highlight in the importance of the paving program, because when you think about potholes, and we've been very successful in dramatically reducing the number of pothole repairs that we've had to undertake because we funded the paving program. So a pothole, a moderate pothole is not dangerous for a car, but if you're on an e-bike or on a scooter, a moderate pothole can even result in an accident and an injury. So the more we're using our paved streets for e-bikes and for scooters, we really need to maintain them in good condition.
That's how I broke my collarbone when I was on the board, and the pothole was fixed 2 days later.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, anyway, we can keep moving.
Yes.
One for the team.
Yeah, kind of.
Wow,
Yes.
that's a lot.
All right.
And then finally, I think the last slide that we have before we do a wrap up is our sidewalks program. If we could just go to the next slide.
And
If
I
we could
do
just
note the
advance.
increase in cost on asphalt. Thank you for putting that there.
Yes. Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Thank
Keep
you for
going.
noticing
Yep.
that. And our sidewalks program, we have just completed our 2024 condition assessment, and the pie chart there shows you, where we've landed. And so as you look at the pie chart, the areas of concern for us are the yellow, the orange, and the red. And all of those add up to 20%. 20% of our sidewalks are rated fair, poor, or very poor. And so that's why this program, for us to proactively maintain our sidewalks, is really important. And in fiscal 2024, we have started our concrete zone maintenance program, where we go through and we replace sidewalk. We don't just shave to get rid of the tripping hazards. We are actually replacing sidewalks, and the goal is to maintain them on a 10-year maintenance cycle.
Can I ask?
Yes, if it's quick.
So, yes, it's quick. 10 years for sidewalks, for concrete sidewalks?
In terms of a maintenance cycle. And before we started this program, I believe they were only on a 20-year maintenance cycle. So it would accelerate the maintenance cycle for sidewalks.
Yeah, because I was under the impression it was a 20-year cycle.
Yes.
Okay.
Better now. Maureen.
Quick question about on the corridor and in Cherrydale and a couple of other places, there's brick paver sidewalks. Who maintains those, and how do we go about that?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. It depends. Thanks for answering that,
Depends.
Mr. Schwartz. So yes, it depends. If some of those are part of a site plan, which then becomes the developer's responsibility.
okay.
But some are within our right-of-way, and we are responsible. And by the way, the paver dip ramps are not ADA compliant.
Oh, that's a fun thing to learn. Yeah, I know that they can be kind of a pain, and I certainly can think of at least 7 locations I walk by daily that are no longer even, and it's not clear most of the time who is actually responsible for that. So I think that's just something for us to continue thinking about in terms of our sidewalk program.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to go ask Susan, and then I'll come back to you. Susan?
Two questions. One is on trade-offs. So the depth of complexity of transportation funding is quite remarkable. So can you give a layman's answer to, for instance, if you delayed a metro station entrance, could you, how much bus frequency could you increase? Or if you delay a metro entrance and move it to schools, like how many pennies are left if you take it out of transportation, right? So sort of two questions of the local contribution and the fungibility within transportation.
So if you delay a metro station project that has grant funding, all the grant funding is gone. The local funds that remain, it depends on which station you're referencing, but they are constrained by the eligibilities outlined in the state code. They cannot be used for schools. That's the easy answer to that question. But the harder answer, to get to your other question about transit service, the Transit Strategic Plan and the expansion associated with that is fully programmed in the CIP. We're basing expansion on that had a robust public process and a service operations analysis based on ridership. That is something that we do update. I don't know that we could, without another study, look to expand service beyond what was already anticipated in the TSP.
And maybe is there equivalent to the quick build that we've gotten so good at on the capital side to pilot, 3 months of increased service on one, 7-minute headways or something on one bus line? Is there any, there's a lot of passion for that in the community, and I think it intersects with that question of how to get people back on buses. Is there flexibility for that, or how might we as a board create flexibility for that going forward?
When we did the TSP study, we actually had a very robust, I would say, community engagement and outreach that includes meetings and also at the bus stop pop-ups to talk to people. So we collected a lot of information, and based on those feedback, we developed the 10-year TSP, which we believe has captured the sort of the majority of the needs that we have heard, which it also includes frequency increase. Sarah was alluding to that. Any additional increase, is that going to be actually be verified by the actual ridership increase? We don't know. What we are proposing right now, we believe the ridership will react to that kind of improved service.
So we don't feel like it's specifically resource constrained. It's phased in such a way that you think will maximize ridership.
So another feature for the TSP, I hear you talking about sort of try things and see how they react. I think another feature of TSP that captures that spirit is we do call for annual data collection, review of that. And then so every year, actually this is also encouraged by DRPT, every year if we recognize a shift in the needs or a shift in the travel pattern, we have that opportunity to make adjustment. The 10-year plan is to capture the overall trend at it's just like our CIP, to our best ability to predict. And that also allows the state agency to program their funding that they think the localities may be needed. But then every year, based on what's the actual ridership, what's the actual performance, we do have opportunity to adjust.
I have another question on streetlights, but I bet someone has a follow-up.
Okay, I think Takas has one, and then I can come back to you for streetlights. Takas, did you have a question?
So one thing that I wanted to really understand on the paving and the PCI, I think, is the target is 75 to 80. So, but really, actually it's more rather on the upper side, like 80. However, the spending that you look in nominal terms is beginning to increase slightly. I mean, there is an increase.
Yes.
This is just the inflation of that.
It's
So this is just
inflation.
the additional, the marginal cost per unit.
Correct.
However, you said also that it becomes more complicated. So for example, we do more through Vision Zero. It is not easy to, I mean, you have a lot of smaller areas to pave, so you have your more complicated project. This is factored in this.
Well,
This is factored in.
So I should clarify, I might have confused matters, but the Army-Navy Complete Streets program, all of that is the cost of that is contained in that program. I was just mentioning that, you know, it's a major arterial street, so in about 7 years later, we will come through with our paving program to do the micro surfacing to extend the life of the pavement. And when we do that, we actually erase all the pavement markings and we have to restore them. It automatically, the process of doing that gets rid of all the pavement markings and you have to restore them. And pavement markings, because they're more complex, that cost is reflected in the paving program, the need to restore the markings that were there before the paving program comes through, and that cost is certainly going up every year.
Thank you.
Susan, you had a question about streetlights, I think it was.
I just wondered, I see the streetlight number, which is kind of a small part of all the transportation, but it has increased. And I also know we had the streetlight master plan, and we're just beginning to sort of touch some of those lights. And I wondered if you could give a brief community update now, or we can schedule it for another time if it's longer than that. How's it going with streetlights?
I remember when we were putting the streetlight management plan together, I will say back then, the conditions are more urgent. So we have seen effects of a more organized and also a strategized approach to streetlights. That is, we're benefiting from that. For example, you know, people have more guidance and knowledge into the selection of the lights, the requirement, the standards. Those are all upgraded during the streetlight management plan period. I do want to point out, though, just like any plan, we will learn from while we are implementing that and find out that there are things that need to be adjusted or updated, or, you know, maybe a better approach that can serve us better. So we do, we're considering sort of providing necessary updates to the plan.
That does it? All right. I think we're in the home stretch.
We are in the home stretch, and the last two slides, we've talked to some extent about through the rest of the presentation, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. The CIP is constrained. I think we've mentioned that a number of times today. It's been mentioned in previous presentations, and due to that local funding capacity, we've assumed a high probability of success for external funds. That's a risk. It may be unlikely, but it's also not impossible. We feel that it passes this sort of like, you know, the test of does this make sense or does it not? We think it's reasonable, but there's risk there. And we would have to make decisions in a future CIP if some of these grant opportunities were not to come to pass. This includes both developer contributions and grant opportunities. We have Core of Roslyn and CC to DCA, as I mentioned, and then PROAG. We've talked about that a number of times, so I won't get into that anymore. So finally, in summary, on the next slide, we have a CIP that we believe advances the goals of our current adopted policy across a number of different county initiatives. The policy guidance from the MTP, as we discussed earlier, will be ready for the 2029 CIP with some elements to be discussed during the next CIP update. We continue to face uncertainty with inflation as well as easement negotiations that can have some projects lag or in some cases just not be feasible. However, over the long term, I just wanted to leave the community of the board with 3 thoughts that we're pondering at the staff level that we hope to provide more clarity on as we continue to dialogue over the next couple of years. How do we incorporate evolving technology, both technology we manage and technology that appears in the right-of-way? What does the future of telework look like, and how does that impact travel trends? How does that impact metro? How does that impact bike share? These are things that we're tracking as well, and that relates to data, both the data that we gather from those sources, but also data that we compile on our own. How can we harness all of that to make more informed decisions? we'd be happy to take more questions.
Thank you. We've had a lot of questions. We have our vice chair, I think, from the Transportation Commission here with us. If, Ashton, would you like to come up, Mr. Morotovich? And maybe we'll get inspired by some more questions. Welcome. Looks good. You're on.
All right, thank you for having me.
Thank you for, this was long. Thank you. It is fascinating, yes.
All right, so I'll just start by reading off my notes to make sure I don't miss anything. The current CIP proposal includes many great projects that will improve Arlingtonians' quality of life, and I believe is a continuation of the award-winning work of both board and staff. But as Transportation Commission representative, I would like to not just congratulate, but highlight some opportunities that we believe could be used to improve and create a truly world-class network that is efficient, safe, and improves the health and productivity of Arlingtonians. First, we agree with the letter by the chair of the Neighborhood Complete Streets Commission, Elisa Ortiz, that funding for the program should remain above $3 million per fiscal year. The current proposal cuts funding by more than half in the second fiscal year and maintains a relatively low level of funding. Funding this program is important for many reasons. Firstly, the county is the only source of funding. It cannot compete for state and federal funds. At the same time, the program, as already addressed, has taken care of some of the low-hanging fruit projects that are cheaper. New projects will be more expensive, especially considering the need to adhere to the new and more demanding PROAC standards that we've already covered a bit. Simply put, the current CIP will require that program to do more with less funding. Moving on to another matter, there is almost unanimous concern on the Transportation Commission with current plans to switch to BEV buses. Emissions for public transportation, as already mentioned during this session, account for less than 1% of total emissions. Meanwhile, there's a huge environmental upside in modal shift from private vehicles to buses. Excuse me, my notes disappeared. Might have to do without them.
That's why us baby boomers always have paper.
Yeah. But in order to achieve this environmental upside, we need frequent and reliable bus service. Recent ART data indicates a decrease in on-time bus performance, and we are concerned that more expensive BEV buses with lower range and performance will exacerbate this negative trend. While we understand that technology is improving and could improve greatly by the time purchase is needed, we don't want to repeat the example across the river of the DC circulator where costs went up and resulted in a decrease in service due to funding issues. Furthermore, some commissioners have highlighted that studies have not considered the possibility of new generation trolley buses, which are reliable, zero-emission, quiet, popular, and proven in countries around the world. Instead, we have focused on more expensive and less reliable BEV technology. The Transportation Commission also has a concern with the rising cost of the second Boston Metro entrance. Last year, the county share was at $30 million. Now it's at over 50. The same is true of the Crystal City entrance, but at least that will facilitate direct connectivity to important regional and national infrastructure. So the VRE, a potential Amtrak stop, national airport via the CC to DCA connection, and even if we're lucky, MARC connectivity if through running happens. So we understand that costs will continue to rise if we don't act, and that there is grant funding to assist with the construction. We also wonder whether $50 million will be more impactful if invested in other transportation priorities. Finally, we have concern with timeframe of the bike trail construction. Citizens shouldn't have to wait over a decade for the completion of a bike trail. The beginning of this session highlighted the record Capital Bike Share ridership, more than 500,000 rides in May. There is clearly a significant and rising demand for this mode of transportation, and declining cost of e-bikes will only contribute to this demand by expanding the pool of riders. Current timelines, however, some as long as 12 years, might lead citizens to believe the county is not serious about building a more comprehensive trail network. I don't believe that to be true, but I do believe that we should find ways to accelerate construction of a bicycle network that would increase mobility and financial freedom and improve health outcomes for residents of all ages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Colleagues, any more questions for staff or for Mr. Mortovich? Matt?
I said I'd limit questions, so I'll say just a big thank you for that, both for some laudatory pieces and also opportunities for improvement or however you framed it, and also thank you to Ms. Crawford and both of you and the entire team for a thorough and excellent presentation. No question.
Okay, thank you. Susan?
I don't know a lot about what the trolley buses are, so just tagging that for me to learn more, but I assume maybe they're not made in the US. Is that part of the challenge?
They are.
What's a trolley bus?
Help us.
Let's,
Well, it's kind of like a tram, but it's connected overhead, like catenary wires, but it's
catenary wires.
bus.
You've got the whole electric system.
Yeah, so you can like move around, park cars and whatnot. It's not on fixed rails.
Yep, got it. Thank you.
Several US cities have them. Seattle is a famous one, and they are produced in the US, as far as I know, at least. Very longevous. I mean, we both grew up in cities that know what this is and how it works, and it's extremely efficient. I mean, you don't need the battery. That's it.
Yep, got it. But you do need the wires. Okay, go
But you
ahead.
need the wires, indeed, and that's a major CAP item if we ever consider that, besides anything else. I wanted to ask another question, because for me, this the trail, the more than decade delay of the trails, did the commission discuss if pressured, constrained CIP, what would be a priority? Would it be the Arlington Boulevard, or which would be the trail that would need to be advanced?
So we didn't kind of rank priorities. We only had one session on the CIP, the informational session last week, which was very helpful, but we didn't rank priorities. I think, I mean, if we were to rank it, I think there would be a preference for trails that lead to schools, but I don't want to speak for the commission on a matter that we haven't discussed.
Fair. Thank you so much for all the work, everybody.
Thank you. Maureen? you have something?
That was basically my question.
Okay. Anything else? Goodness gracious, I think we're done with transportation. Thank you. Incredible work. You may have some more to say,
No, I
but
was going
thank
to
you
say,
so
you know,
much. This was
thank
great.
everybody. I'm going to ask Jason to come up. We have, next is Metro and debt service.
Yep.
You will have seen a lot of the slides in the debt service presentation already. So they may not take a lot of time. I think it's important. We don't have that many slides on Metro, but since that is one of our biggest capital expenditures, I think you all are fairly familiar with that part of it. This is more for our public to understand how we put it together.
No, that's fine,
So-
and a refresher is not bad, and we're going to be hosting the
So with
Metro group
that,
here.
I will
so-
turn it over to Jason.
All right, Mr. Freeze.
Thank you, Mark. Yep. So Mark is correct. I'm going to be very brief in the second half with debt service, since we went pretty in depth in the proposed CIP presentation. So that'll be brief, and I'll really just be opening it up for questions from you all. But first, we have Metro. So first slide, want to provide a background here. So as most of you know, some of you are new, I just wanted to talk, Metro, as you know, the county is part of the WMATA Compact, along with Montgomery and Prince George's County in Maryland, the district, and then Alexandria, Fairfax, Loudoun, Falls Church, and Fairfax City in Virginia. Each of these jurisdictions are responsible for a share of the net operating and capital costs, not funded by fares, federal revenues, and other revenue sources of the agency. There is currently a funding formula that is in place at Metro that determines each jurisdiction's share of costs, with individual formulas each for rail, Metro bus, and paratransit. For Arlington, those, once you run through those formulas on the operating side, it comes to around 6.9% and a little bit higher on the capital side just due to the nature of the projects there. As I mentioned, so on capital, it's that same formula, but then it's applied based on each mode, rail, paratransit, and bus. And so since it's heavier on rail, that's where we're higher on percentages, so our capital percentage is slightly higher. Next slide, please. So here, just want to show you, actually, I stole this from Metro, but I thought it was a very, very good infographic that shows, their budget kind of in a nutshell. So you see their total operating budget is about $2.3 billion, while their capital budget is $2.5 billion. And they are the second largest rail system in the US, sixth largest bus network. There are over 10,000 bus stops in the region, as well as 98 rail stations within DC, Maryland, and Virginia. 11 of those rail stations do serve Arlington County on the blue, orange, yellow, and silver lines. Next slide. So here, I've shown this every time we've done a CIP recently. I've been showing this slide, and this is showing our capital subsidies. And the point of this is to kind of see the big picture that the far left bar there, fiscal 2017, shows really our where our historical capital subsidies were. And you see orange represents what we fund. We fund primarily capital from two sources. One is general obligation bonds, as you've seen in our debt presentations. The other half is we receive some subsidies, state transit aid for both operating capital from the Department of Rail and Public Transit. So those are the two primary sources we use to fund our capital subsidy at Metro. And you see before fiscal 17, it was at a much lower level. Fiscal 18, we had a large bump. That was for some rail cars and some other large purchases that we committed to. And then you see after that we sit a little bit higher, and part of that was around the general managers keeping Metro safe, reliable, affordable presentation, and capping capital subsidy growth at 3%. That's largely held true, but it's also at a larger amount because there was also dedicated funding approved, and within that, the local Virginia jurisdictions are committed to share $27 million of the $154 million that Virginia provides annually. So for us, that comes to about $7 to $8 million additional that we send to the state, who remits it to Metro for their capital program, on top of our normal capital contributions at Metro. What you see on the right side here is the out-year projections that we have in our CIP and that are in line with what WMATA has shown in their 6-year forecast, extrapolated in the out years for 3% growth. Why it is highlighted in a red box is because there is a lot of uncertainty potentially, depending on what happens with any resolution on the operating budget at Metro. As I think we all know, this year was a difficult budget process to solve that funding issue. We were fortunate that the state committed to, with our large increase in our operating subsidy at Metro, the state matched us with 50%. We, as well as other jurisdictions in Virginia, had some funding to help meet that match. However, if there is not a long-term solution to address this gap, or if there's not a substantial rise in ridership and revenues, there is a potential that one of the tricks that Metro has been using to not tricks, but budgetary procedures strategy is definitely not. It's customary in other agencies. So it's just a change in how they do things. Is to move their preventative maintenance some more to their capital budget versus their operating budget. What that does is, for the normal capital projects they've already got programmed in their budget, it may crowd those out depending on the capacity they have available, and that could potentially happen if there is no operating budget resolution as early as fiscal 27 or fiscal 2028. If that happens, our projections may go higher than this. I don't want to provide an estimate right now because we don't necessarily know, but it would be higher than this. Right now, we believe that there will be some sort of resolution, and so, or that it should not impact capital. So our assumptions in the CIP follow the 3% annual escalation in the capital costs for the jurisdictions, and that's what we're reflecting in the CIP over 10 years.
Okay.
So if we go to the next slide. This is just to show again that we use two primary funding sources. About 60% over the 10-year CIP comes from general obligation bonds, while the other 40%, 158 million, is coming from state transit aid, again from DRPT. Next slide. And then this is a breakdown of by referenda, what we are presenting. So $240 million on the right. And I wanted to show what we had for a 10-year total on the left in our prior 10-year CIP, fiscal 23 through 32. So it's a little bit higher, about $10 million higher, so a 4% increase. However, when you look at each individual referenda, we're fairly in line. And again, that's because of this, the 3% cap, and for the most part adhering to that year by year, it's roughly in line, and then just that fiscal 2032 is a little higher than fiscal 2022, resulting in that 4% increase. Next slide. So here, Chair Garvey, I know you asked a little bit about on capital, could we compare ourselves to other jurisdictions? It's a difficult task to do because there's a lot of factors that go into it. It could be, number of rail stations, amount of service you get in your jurisdiction. But here I just wanted to show a few different ways that we could look at the subsidy. One is on a per capita basis, the budget, and I show both operating and capital subsidy, but looking at those on a per capita basis for each jurisdiction, and then also as a percentage of the local operating budgets. So on a per capita basis, Arlington's the second highest contribution at about $411 for operating and $106 for capital. DC being the highest on both categories, while Alexandria is third, followed by the Maryland jurisdictions, then Fairfax and Loudoun. When you look at the percentage of local general fund budgets, we fall more in the middle with combined capital and operating subsidies around 7.3% of our revenues. This comparison may not be apples to apples, like I mentioned. However, the chart at the bottom shows, the different jurisdictions have different levels of service. Like I said, in Arlington, we have 10 stations, Alexandria 4.5, DC has 40. So different jurisdictions have a different level of service or availability of rail, as well as you look at the amount of revenue miles of bus service that's provided in each jurisdiction. So I didn't provide it here, but if you were to look at those, look at, say, if you were to take, for example, on a per station basis, how many on the rail side in your rail subsidy, how many stations you have, and what per station, how much you're paying. It would be about $5 to $6 million for all jurisdictions. So it gets a little bit more even on the rail subsidy when you look at that. And then on bus, again, if you look at just revenue miles, it starts to get a little bit more even, where we're more of the middle of the pack on a revenue mile basis in terms of how much we pay. I think it's about $24, $25 per mile when you think about the subsidy at Metro.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you.
So looking ahead on the next slide.
So could you just say, as things are changing a lot right now and have been, what years are these subsidies calculated on? So for instance, if next year WMATA takes away the 3Y and a bunch of other buses and we have fewer miles, do we still pay for a couple of years until that catches up, or is it real time?
The subsidy works where it really takes the actuals from prior years, but when we've had bus cuts, we've been able to get them more into current years with an adjustment. So, but the formula really uses the historical actuals to make the calculation.
And it's 1 year off, or is it? So how does COVID go
if
through
we're
the
right
snake
now,
here?
next year's budget would have last year's actuals because you can't have the 24 for 25. It's a 2-year lag from when they're preparing it. 1 year before dictates 1 year after.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I had one, I just wanted to, on the funding sources.
Yes.
I love this state transit aid, but some of this money is state transit aid that's supposed to come to us, and instead of giving it to us, they give it to Metro. And they say it comes from the state, but it really kind of comes from us, is that?
I believe that's it's more so the MVTA monies, right?
Operating? Yeah, not so much the capital. Thank you. Yep.
No, so on the final slide, looking ahead, again, that our CIP's assuming that these 3% escalations in capital subsidy remain, and that over the next year to 18 months, that the region, as it comes together on the operating side, that there is something that is recommended there. And we may, depending on what happens there, when we come back for the next CIP 2 years from now, we may have to revise this. So we want to caution you that that's a potential. Right now, we're kind of, we're cautiously optimistic of a resolution and we're watching it. We didn't decide to change the CIP just yet because we don't know what that will be. However, it is something that, for you all not to be surprised 2 years from now when we present the CIP, that there is potential that that could be a change, a shift in our capital plan.
Yeah. I would think if there's a change, I may not be at this table, but I think everybody else will, and you'll be here on an off-cycle presentation on where we really are, probably, so thank you. And colleagues, any more questions for Mr. Fries? Matt?
Just, it would help me if you could, on slide 7, the different rail subsidy and bus subsidy, if that is a summary of a formula for our share, which I think it is, if you're able to send me a link to where that is, because I'm going to have to learn that, and then the compact itself, at least for me, I'll have to read it and learn it over the coming weeks. So if you can send those two, that'd be huge help.
Absolutely. We get, we've requested, so each year WMATA actually sends the, what's called the Jurisdictional Coordinating Committee. They send us, you'll enjoy it. It's a nice long Excel file with 20 different tabs that goes through the calculations, how they're formulated.
That's great.
But it
I'll
breaks
ask
down.
Susan to interpret it for me.
You see generally on slide 7, bottom left, that there is, the rail subsidy, it's 1/3 your weekday ridership, 1/3 your density weighted population, and then 1/3 your share of stations. So the percentages are there. I didn't show paratransit because that's more directive. It's really more based on your ridership. But there is a formal, calculation, and they do provide that backup so we can verify.
Thank you.
All right, great. Anything else for Mr. Fries? I think not at the moment.
Okay.
I know,
So
next.
we will hop to debt service, and like I said, this is going to be extremely fast, since we have, the majority of these slides we have already presented to you. So we go to slide 10. This is just to remind you that of the CIP, 34% of the planned funding in our $4.5 billion CIP is from general obligation bonds. This includes both new bonds that will be in future referenda over the next 5 cycles, which is the 24, 26, 28, and 30, and 32 referenda, as well as some bonds that we have from prior referenda years that have not been issued yet, that will be issued in the coming years for projects that are still ongoing. Next slide, please.
Jason, the 16% previously approved, is that bond funding or what is?
16% previously approved here. That's other things other than bond funding.
It's
So it could be
grants and-
grants, it could be state transit aid, it could be other previous funding that's not from the bond source, correct?
And it's all committed already, so it's.
It should all be committed, correct, yes.
And is there a significant portion of that that's from the, the COVID bill, I forget what it was called. The federal government provided not. I was just wondering, the federal government provided a whole bunch? No?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
that's all
just
been spent,
checking.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So on the next slide, which you have already seen, so brief, again, this is just showing the impact of our CIP and planned bond issuance, as well as schools' planned bond issuance, which, as you all discussed at the county board, school board work session earlier this week, this is assuming, they have a couple different scenarios. This is their MPSA option 2 scenario, which is their middle ground of debt issuance, is what these debt numbers are showing. So just again to show that, the debt service increases while they're in line with our policies, they are in the moderate, they're in the moderate category and may put pressure on other county services, since much of the future debt service will be fixed expenditures that will be met once we issue the bonds. Next slide. Again, this is just showing the breakdown of debt service over 10 years, showing existing and new debt, but also showing, and related to what we just talked about with Metro, how much has been issued historically as well as planned in the future for Metro. And so you see that it's about 20-25% for Metro, and then the rest is for all other county projects. Next slide.
And Jason, Barcroft is in the all other county there on page 12.
It's in the, so Barcroft is in this one, should be in the existing, yes.
Existing county.
This is existing, it was contracted
Yeah.
before that, so it's.
Yeah, in fact, that's what we're trying
And
to
so-
get a little smaller. Yeah, Matt?
On Barcroft, hasn't our I mean, interest rates have gone way up, so that's more. But we've 30 million in principal, so net we're down, correct?
Correct. And that's, I believe that's
So-
also it's reflected.
It's coming down. So we have brought it from 150 to 135 now. Just last week, we made another payment. So now it's at $120 million, but rates have gone to, the all-in rate right now is just under 6% that we have in the line of credit. I think when we started for the first year, we were able to lock in 1%. So it was a substantial
Very
increase.
painful.
We decided to go out as long as we could initially at 12 months, and we locked in the rate, but we were subject to the rates 12 months from there, which was much higher. So there is some savings by paying down. And so that's factored in. So the debt numbers here have that assumption.
So we don't, I guess I'm trying to remember my interest rate, I struggled most in fifth grade with that. But beyond that, so net, is it come down, annual payments, or going up with the 1 to 6%? Because we did a huge principal reduction, so 6% on 120 is less,
but not
but
enough.
still net up? I'm not sure.
It's net up from year one. Yeah. So 1% on 150 million was $5 million a year.
Yeah.
6% on 150 would have been 9. Now it's 120 would be 7.2 million. 7.2, still
up
substantially
6 million
higher
or
than
5,
the
6
initial. But we were also, we're incredibly fortunate to lock in that 12-month rate, knowing that that was an anomaly at that time. So we took advantage of rates that we'll probably not see again for a long time.
Sure. So you guys all
Not in my
kicked my
lifetime.
tail on fifth grade, and you know what you're doing, so.
It was- last year
But
it
that's
was
all the,
Last year it was, the debt service was 7.8 million, the total, and 7.2 of the reduced. So,
But if interest rates go down, we can refinance, right? We do that.
absolutely.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we're hopeful. We're not going to bake that in, but we're going to hope that the rates continue to go down and
We're all watching
stay
the
below
Fed.
budget.
Yes, thank you. All right. Adhering to, adhering to debt policies. I think we're ready. Go on.
Yep, here in debt slide. So next slide. So this is again the one we normally follow, the 10%.
Yeah.
So you see again we get to about 9.8% in the out years, fiscal 31, 32, but we stay comfortably below. Next slide. These are the other policies we have. So again, we remain in compliance with all of them. 2 and 3 are the per capita debt to income, and then per debt as a percentage of market value. Both of those we are within policy. And then number 4, we had discussed on the slide before about growth in debt service of the 10-year planning period. While it's high, it's within our historical growth. It's just on a little bit higher than before, about 3% on average, 3.6%, sorry.
Quick question about the rating agencies. How do they view, are all of these equally important, these 4 policies that we have?
They're taken in context with many other factors. There are factors that are beyond our control, economic and demographic, within the region, incomes of our residents, of the region itself. You have management. They rate management, how we perform. We have our pensions and OPEB and those liabilities. There are a lot of factors that go in. These are all, we consider them equally important. That's why we put them in our policy. And these were, best practices that we, in working with our consultants, PFM, who have been our consultants for probably a little over 2 decades now. But they work with many other jurisdictions. They look at our peers, and we look at, in order to be a AAA municipality, of people who are of similar operating structure and size, what do we need to do? And these are the recommendations, and we continue to tweak them from time to time, but these are the general ones that we believe will keep us AAA.
Okay, thank you. This is sort of the gold standard for policies.
That's what
Okay,
we
thank
believe,
you.
yes.
Yep.
And we were just confirmed, I forget when the last one just came out, but we do have our AAA rating retained again.
Good.
In preparation for, on June 18th, we'll be having our next bond sale
Excellent.
for county and schools.
Excellent.
So,
All right,
yeah.
good. How many years is that now?
24.
24 years.
24 years AAA. We've been double AAA for longer than that.
Yeah. Good. Congratulations. Thank you.
And thank you.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, next slide. This is, one more slide, sorry. This one, okay, stabilization reserve. So this is a new slide that was not in when we had the manager's
Okay.
proposed budget. But as you all probably know from the 25 operating budget adoption, we increased the funding for the stabilization reserve. So with that, as we're reviewing our financial policies and we're looking at the CIP, we decided to put a recommendation in here to increase, currently we have a 1% minimum on the stabilization reserve, to increase that to 1.3% where it currently is right now. And so you see here in the second paragraph there is the only change is to just make that change from 1 to 1.3% of the stabilization reserve.
And this puts us on the low end compared to other jurisdictions, is that correct?
Correct, yeah. We have a slide that we've gotten from PFM. So when we look at, we again, our peer analysis, we are on the lower end. Now, we are a little bit different again than some other jurisdictions, but we do fall lower, and we've had sometimes in the past with rating agencies saying, they'll comment that we have lower balances. Not that it affects our AAA right now, but that it's just something that they note as to keep an eye on. Yes.
Yep, now we can tell them we're up a little bit. Okay.
It's always good to go back to them and tell them we've raised either the core reserve or other reserves that we have available. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I think we can keep going.
Yep. And so I think we can skip the next slide. We've already talked about the referendum and the
Yep.
proposed budget. And then slide 17 is just showing not just the county's referenda, but also schools, again, with the option 2, what they were proposing, which is $73 million on the 24 referenda and $473 million total over 10 years. And then as well as stormwater and utilities and what they're putting on this referenda, as well as the 10-year totals, which is $218 million for stormwater and $360 million, $361 for utilities. Stormwater, they're primarily for stormwater is primarily for out years for some of the resiliency efforts, and then for utilities, it's primarily for our contributions to Washington Aqueduct and some enhancements to our water supply system and resiliency and redundancy there.
Thank you, and something's happening in 2030 with the redundancy, it looks like, just because it's such a large increase.
I believe that's starting for planning for a potential regional
effort,
solution to
which
the
is great.
redundancy. Right, so it's a planning figure right now.
Thank you. And then a question on schools. I thought we had provided a placeholder for them for 50,000, 50?
These are on 2-year cycles.
Oh,
So
yes.
you split these in half, 50/50.
Oh, you double them, yes.
Yep,
got
so
it.
this is showing each referenda cycle, what would potentially be on the referendum.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, thank you. Colleagues, questions for Mr. Feet? Yeah, Maureen.
Why are we proposing 0 for stormwater this year?
They have existing bond funding from prior bond so that's the authorized and issue bonds. They're using those, and so they don't necessarily need new referenda just yet.
They have
That's why
sufficient.
they have sufficient funding there. So they're still issuing bonds. It's just from that
But not
old bucket.
new.
Correct.
Okay, great, thank you.
Matt?
So slide 14, the ratio of debt per capita to per capita income, number 2 and number 4. I'm trying to translate that back into slide 11, which is the sort of grid-like item. And I can't, like the percentages, I don't see 5.4% for.
No, they're different. They're different factors. So slide 11 is showing simply our debt service and debt service growth. Slide 14, when you look at per capita debt to per capita income, that's looking at per capita, so our residents and their per capita income as reported by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, I believe, that puts out that figure. So we look at that number, we assume, I believe it's 2.4% growth. I believe it's 2.4% growth annually in that reported number in our projections. It's looking at the per capita income number, and then we take the population and we take our debt and we divide the debt that we have to get that per capita number and then compare the two.
And the same is true with respect to number 4 on that slide. It's not quite, it's not shown on slide 11. It would be something that I'd have to maybe ask you to just have a short conversation or ask whoever on DMF.
The numbers are not shown there, but on slide 11 on the right side, we show the averages in those 2 boxes for number 4. So number 4 is that growth over the 10-year planning period is no greater than the 10-year historical growth of revenues. The orange box on the right, 4.4%, that is in slide 11.
So the blue box is the debt.
4.4 is historical. I'm sorry?
The 10-year growth is the growth in the debt.
Yeah.
The 10-year is historical growth in the budget, which is 4.4%. Yeah, the blue box is the debt, and that's the forward-looking.
Okay, so I'd love a conversation. So the dawn of time, Keynesian economics, the more you invest in capital, the greater your overall economy is, therefore, the greater growth you have. And so I just love a conversation because when I was school budget chair, we were way above 8.1, which is where, 1.3, which is where schools are. And we were way above 8.8, which is where we are right now in the first year. I'm not trying to be, but I do want to see if there's additional investments, like Carlin Springs is right now the only one on the list. I'm not saying that there aren't others, but like, and I know there's a lot of economic uncertainty starting with November, but like, I'd love a conversation to see how much is 0.7% under 10% for us, and how much room we have, because on all three of those metrics, I think we're underneath, and I don't want to be fiscally irresponsible. I also want to invest if we can. And so I think that's a separate conversation with Mark and Michelle and whoever the DMF team, so that I'm not annoying, but I am learning.
I think structurally, we land always underneath, right?
We would never present a CIP that's over,
Yeah,
right?
so-
We would
Sort of
we would
like a
get phone calls
balanced
from
budget.
rating agencies immediately on why did you decide to exceed yourself?
Yeah, one thing I did want to mention, and this is more of a wrap-up comment, which is we have over there, Nicole's been taking notes of your questions. We'll try to get you the follow-up information quickly. That may mean some in a week, some in 10 days, 2 weeks, a little less than that. But Jason does have material that we can send to you that shows the year-over-year growth in the county debt service from the 10 years ago up until now, so you get a sense. There were some years where our debt service actually went down year over year. Some years where it went up. The reason why we've made a big deal about this is that I can't recall a time where we've shown our debt service going up consistently this amount of money year over year. And so that, and where it's highlighted in yellow. And there's nothing right or wrong about that, but that is going to come home to roost when you're preparing the operating budget. It's just an additional bill that shows up every year. So hypothetically, if you wanted to increase expenditures on Carlin Springs Road, let's say it was, I don't know, let's say it was 10 million, you wanted to make it 20 million, I think that the constraint there is probably not going to be so much on the debt service side, because that's probably, well, I take that back. It would be like another million, right? It would be another million. You're going to put pressure on the operating budget and then also push up against the 10% limit. But all these things can be moved around and readjusted. But I would tell you that I think what I'm going to suggest you do is you're going to have to make trade-offs in the first couple of years. If you want to increase transportation spending on Carlin Springs, that means maybe you do a little less somewhere else. If you want to bump it up higher, then you're going to be getting those kinds of effects here, where you're going to have let's just say whoever's chair next year in the budget, you're already starting $4.7 million behind. And you're going to have to either raise taxes or make cuts to do that.
That helps, thanks.
Well,
Same
we have
conversation.
also the inflation of the general governance, as
Right,
I say,
right.
which is about 4.4.
Right, and just to get, and I think Jason has the information, we can get that to you pretty quickly about what's happened over the last 10 years, or what's actually happened since you've been on the board, Matt.
Susan,
Just salaries
Yeah.
must account for almost 40% of that.
Yeah, I'm just talking about debt service.
yeah. Susan's
Jason,
light's been on.
can you recap the interest rates that are assumed here for the school debt and the county debt? And you said it's 6% for the Barcroft debt.
Yep, so Barcroft is the one, that's the only variable rate debt we have currently. Well, Barcroft and our line of credit for short-term finance, everything else is bonds, and so we assume 5% on all of those.
And is that true for schools and county right now?
We issue all the debt for both schools and ourselves.
Yeah, we don't let,
We'll have a data point on June 19th.
we will, right.
Well, you're selling on the 18th, but you don't want to tell them until the 19th, right? Remember that. Keep it a secret. Keep it a secret for a day.
Yeah, can I ask something on Barcroft? So there is also some incoming money. So we loaned money, right? So we borrowed money to loan money. So are the proceeds of that loan counting against that, or is it a separate accounting?
As the phases of Barcroft get negotiated, they'll transition, I believe, into like AHIF loans as a portion of each of those projects. So I would say that there's a potential some of those could come back.
Yeah.
Some of that may go in as the AHIF
So this
contributions.
is
the gross debt. There's a, I mean, it's not the net after any income, because they may transition, so they are not,
Yeah, this is
Starting
this
to
is simply
reduce.
on the liability side. This is our $120 million now. It doesn't take into account any contributions that may come in if they do.
okay.
That's the question.
Good to know. Thank you.
Okay. Colleagues, any more questions for Mr. Freeze? Mr. Manager, I think that's it.
We're lucky to have you.
Yeah, no, Jason, it's always good to see you. I think with everything going on with Metro, the board's going to see you more next year. Thank you so very much. Really appreciate it now. And I appreciate that extra information for me. Thank you. All right, everybody, we're adjourned. We next get back together, I think it's June 11. Do I have that right?
Tomorrow, right?
Oh, tomorrow?
For the schools.
Closed session, but that's not for our public. Yeah, it's fine. All right.
You know what electric trolley buses are very good at?
Uh,
VR.